Welcome to the Explainer. So, have you ever looked at a 2,000-year-old text and thought to yourself, what is this actually trying to say? Today, we're taking the academic study of biblical interpretation and framing it as a thrilling detective's investigation. Because we aren't just reading here. We're gathering evidence, we're analyzing clues, and we're deducing meaning using a really highly structured toolkit. By the end of this Explainer, I promise you're going to see ancient texts in a completely different light. Okay, let's dive into this. Take this incredibly famous quote from Matthew 16:19, where Jesus says to Peter, "I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven." Now, people have literally debated for centuries about what these keys actually represent. But like any good detective, we need to look closely at the smallest details first. And the grammar itself? That's our first major clue. Just look at the inflection of that verb, will give. It is strictly in the future tense. This brilliantly illustrates how a simple grammatical inflection completely limits the possibilities of our investigation. I mean, if the keys will be given, it means Peter and the disciples absolutely did not possess them yet at that point in the narrative. Grammar matters immensely, you guys. It sets the boundaries of what a text can and cannot mean. So here is our investigative roadmap for the Explainer today. First, we'll uncover historical background secrets. Second, we're tracking the text's history. Third, consulting exegetical commentaries. And finally, we'll do a case study defining true wisdom. Starting with Section 1, Historical Background Secrets, let's find that context. You know, an author always assumes their original readers just knows certain things about the world they both live in. But because we live thousands of years later, we're missing that shared context. We have to actively reconstruct it to grasp the actual message. For example, in Matthew 13, Jesus tells this famous parable about a sower who just throws seed absolutely everywhere, on paths, on rocks, and thorns. To us today, that just sounds like, well, farming. But historical context reveals that ancient seed was incredibly expensive. Normal sowing meant meticulously testing the soil, so not a single seed was wasted. No farmer in his right mind would sow the way the man in the parable does. Understanding this historical secret creates a massive aha moment. The original audience would have been absolutely shocked by this sower's liberal, almost reckless abandon. And here is another fascinating historical clue from the very next parable, the parable of the weeds. The text uses a highly specific word, zinzania. This isn't just any generic weed in your garden. Historically, we know zinzania looked exactly like wheat until the very end of its growth, and even worse, its roots tangled inextricably with the wheat's roots. This completely explains the mystery of why the farmer couldn't just yank them out. Furthermore, ancient rabbis used this exact plant as a metaphor for evil. Once you know that, suddenly the text just bursts with profound, clear meaning. Moving on to Section 2, Tracking the Text's History. Let's trace those manuscripts. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is understanding how the text survived. We have to remember, the Bible wasn't handed down via printing presses. For nearly 2,000 years, it was transmitted entirely by hand, painstakingly copied by scribes. And let's face it, human hands make mistakes. There's actually a clear distinction between the two ways errors crept into these ancient manuscripts. On one hand, we have unintentional errors. Picture a room full of exhausted monks writing down what a lead monk is reading aloud. They mishear a word, or maybe their eyes just skip a line. Totally an accident. But on the other hand, we have intentional errors. This is where a scribe actually thought, wait, that doesn't sound right. Let me just fix that. They attempted to quote-unquote correct the text to match what they honestly believed the author meant to say. And this leads us to the absolutely crucial discipline of textual criticism, which is the tool that helps us filter out those scribal additions. A super famous piece of evidence here is the long ending of the Gospel of Mark. Chapter 16, verses 9 through 20. Through rigorous text criticism, investigators have determined this was almost certainly an intentional error. Basically, a later edition produced by a scribe who probably felt the original ending of Mark was just a bit too abrupt. We have to know exactly what the original author wrote before we can even begin to decode it. To truly track the text, we also need to look at the history of the tradition itself, which evolved in 4 distinct phases. We start with Phase 1, the historical deeds of Jesus. Then, Phase 2, the oral transmission, where teachings were passed along by word of mouth. As those eyewitnesses started to age, we entered Phase 3, the creation of written sources. And finally, we reach Phase 4, where evangelists compiled those earlier sources into the final Gospels that we read today. Knowing exactly where a piece of text sits on this timeline provides unbelievable context for our investigation. Which brings us to Section 3, Consulting Exegetical Commentaries. Time to bring in the experts. Look, even the greatest detectives in the world don't work alone, right? They rely on forensics, they call in experts, they pull up past case files. In biblical investigation, this means consulting the rich history of scholarly interpretation. But here's the catch: you have to use the right expert for the job. There are three main types of commentaries out there. Devotional commentaries, well, they give you inspiring, warm thoughts. Homiletic commentaries give pastors great ideas for sermons, and those are fantastic, but they aren't going to help us solve a textual mystery. We need the third type: exegetical commentaries. These are strictly evidence-based interpretations. Scholars like Calvin, Wesley, or modern exegetes lay out the cold, hard historical and linguistic facts, allowing us to interact critically with their actual findings.
And finally, Section 4, our case study, Defining Wisdom. Let's apply our toolkit. We've got our tools. We know exactly how to check the history, the grammar, the manuscripts, and the experts. It is time to apply everything we've learned. And I want you to actively participate in this deduction process with me. The text is James chapter 1, verse 5. If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask God. Our central investigative question here is this: what is the true, exact meaning of the word wisdom in this specific verse? So we start with our baseline definition. The original Greek word used here is Sophia. Preliminary dictionaries define Sophia as broad and full intelligence, or the capacity to understand and function accordingly. It heavily implies mental comprehension. But is that all James really means? Just being smart? Well, let's dig a little deeper, because our investigation is about to reveal something much, much more profound.
Let's outline our methodology and see how this builds. We're going to run our clue through a three-step deductive process. Step 1, we'll analyze the immediate context right there in the book of James. Step 2, we'll zoom out and examine how wisdom is used across the broader New Testament. And step 3, we'll trace it all the way back to its Old Testament roots.
Okay, let's analyze clue 1, the immediate context. James says this wisdom comes strictly from God above. It is not some human trait. Next, he places this verse right smack in the middle of a discussion about carrying the heavy weight of difficult trials. But most importantly, the entire book of James is fiercely dedicated to right actions over just thinking. James constantly argues that thinking the right things is utterly useless if it isn't actually paired with doing the right things. He essentially says true faith absolutely must be shown in your works. Next up, we examine the broader New Testament usage. Authors like Paul often contrast human wisdom, which is worldly, purely intellectual, and full of these eloquent arguments, against divine wisdom, which is completely transcendent and reveals God's ultimate plan. Now, James agrees that this wisdom is divine, for sure. However, unlike Paul, James really doesn't tie this wisdom to the Holy Spirit or to deep theological mysteries about Christ. For James, it is intensely practical. And that brings us to clue 2, the Old Testament roots. When we look at the Greek translation of the Old Testament, which is called the Septuagint, the word Sophia takes on a very specific flavor. In the ancient wisdom tradition, wisdom isn't just knowing facts, it is right behavior. It's piety. It is the literal ordering of your entire life around God's reality. In the Old Testament, understanding reality must be translated into physical, tangible action. All right, we have gathered all of our evidence. Now we lay out our final hypotheses. Based on everything we've just seen, wisdom in James 1:5 could really mean one of three things. Number 1, it's just intellectual insight. Number 2, it is strictly right action and behavior. Or number 3, it is the congruence and coherence of right thinking and right action. Look at those options. Based on James's total obsession with matching faith to deeds and the Old Testament roots of ordering your life, which one holds the most weight to you? So the crucial point is, the verdict is absolutely number 3. True wisdom in the book of James is the beautiful congruence and coherence of right thinking and right action. It's simply not enough to just possess knowledge in your head, and it's not enough to just blindly act. This divine gift bridges the gap between knowing the truth and physically doing the truth, especially when you are enduring severe trials. The mystery is solved. And honestly, that brilliantly illustrates the sheer power of this toolkit. By digging into the grammar, historical secrets, textual history, and expert commentaries, we completely transformed what looked like a simple word, wisdom, into a dynamic, life-altering concept. So I want to leave you with this provocative question today. Knowing this structured investigative method, what hidden meaning will you uncover in your next reading? The evidence is waiting for you. Thanks so much for joining me on The Explainer. Keep observing, keep deducing, and I will see you next time.